Intimacy is a pathway to the divine. Today I'm here with the wonderful Dr. Megan Rose. And Dr. Megan is the author of the book Spirit Marriage, Intimate Relationships with Otherworldly Beings. And when I first read Megan's book, I was so excited because I just felt like such a sense of recognition and I felt seen and I just felt like, oh, I'm not alone in my experience. Hallelujah. And then, yeah, I reached out to you. And then, briefly after we started working together, you became a mentor. And I'm so excited to have you on the podcast.
I
Welcome, Megan.
I'm so thrilled to be here, Nadja. I mean, what you just said is the whole reason why I wrote my book and did all the research. I mean, it took me years and years to pull together all the research for it, but really, I wrote it because that when I went through my own um, sort of mystical union process, I didn't really have anything other than Ida Craddock, who I know we want to put a bookmark on and talk about today. But I found Ida and a few other small things here and there, but there was just nothing that really looked at it as a serious spiritual practice and undertaking that I could find. And so that's why I wrote the book, was for myself 30 years ago. And all the things I think I would have wanted to know and the guidance I would have felt like I needed. So it's wonderful to continue to hear people that find it and say, oh, finally I found something that speaks to, my experiences and, you know, the experiences that you're having.
Hmm, awesome. So, I'm going to introduce you formally by reading your bio, and then we're going to just kick off with our conversation.
All right, let's go.
So, yes. So, Dr. Megan Rose is a ceremonial magician, witch, druid, and a Shakta tantric practitioner. She holds a PhD in East West psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies and an MA in religion and ethics from the Graduate Theological Union. Wow. She is chair of the Pastoral Counseling and Chaplaincy Department at Cherry Hill Seminary. Dr. Rose's teachings and practice focus on the integration of pagan and animistic spiritualities with a transpersonal psychological framework. She is on a mission to normalize the paranormal by helping people step into deeper relationship with other than human intelligences. And as I said, Dr. Rose is the author of Spirit Marriage, Intimate Relationships with Otherworldly Beings. So excited to have you. Welcome again.
Thank you.
And so we have one friend joining us live, two friends, Farid and Theresa. So welcome, guys. If you have any questions to Dr. Megan, just type them in the chat and we'll make sure they get answered in the end of our conversation, okay? So, Megan, let's start with spirit marriage. Why would anyone even consider cultivating a relationship with a non-physical, non-human being?
Well, to answer that question, I'm going to just remind everyone, especially folks who haven't read my book, that this practice, this idea of humans having bonded or intimate relationships with otherworldly beings, has been around since the beginning of recorded history. So this is nothing new. Although in our very Western materialistic scientific frame, we think of it as so weird and so unique or so edgy. It's really not. And um all we have to do is turn our attention to the Christian mystics, and we see that nuns have, consider themselves the brides of Christ. They take vows, they wear rings, they're married to Jesus. Priests often consider themselves married to the church. And then we back up time a little bit and we start looking at the experiences of, or back up time a lot and look at to like ancient Mesopotamia and the priests and the priestesses in service to the goddess, particularly Ishtar. And they consider themselves wed to the deity, wed to the god, wed to the goddess. And if we step outside then of the religious framework and we just look at the phenomenology or the embodied experience of humans having bonded, committed relationships with other than human beings, we see it transculturally around the globe, from shamanistic cultures to South Asian religious context and setting. And so it's really not that new of a concept. And so to answer your question of why do we do it? Well, each person that enters into one of these kinds of relationships has different motivation, has different calling, has a different purpose. But as I just described, many of the relationships that are bonded to an otherworldly being or an other than human being are meant to be service-based relationships in service to the spiritual or emotional benefit of humanity, or of not even humanity. Sometimes it's a relationship that you are in a co-creative relationship to better a place of land, right? Or a particular area of cultural interface and development between the humans and the other than human, depending on the other than human that you're bonded to. And when I say other than human, it could be a spirit, like an ancestor, or a what's sometimes called a ascended master, right? Or it could be a deity. Those are probably the most common and readily understood, but it could be a fae, a fairy being, or an elemental being, an angel. I think I mentioned a daimon. There's a variety of different types of other than human beings, or even a body of water, a land mass. Because from an animistic perspective, we ascribe intelligence, right? It might not look like human intelligence, but we ascribe intelligence to other than human systems and beings. So we're doing it in service. Not everybody, but by and large, when you look at it transculturally, it's been done by humans to expand their consciousness, often in service.
Yeah, exactly. That just brings me to my next question, which was like, what are the benefits of such a bond? And you're already bringing it up. Like, one is like really that you also mentioned in your book, like to aid the conscious evolution of humanity, like for co-creation, to bring forth more knowledge. And this just makes me think of like your co-researcher Orion and his relationship with his fairy queen Bree. And they brought up this whole body of work, right, on how to yeah, you know it better. Maybe you should talk about what are they
Yeah.
teaching?
Yeah, so Orion's teachings became known as the fairy teachings, or fairy seership is the tradition. And it is really a reconnective, restorative practice for humans to step back into integral relationship with the land, right? And not just the land, but other than human beings. In this case, in this sort of Western European framework, the fairy people. And yeah, and so his co-creative relationship with Bree really brought about a number of books, a whole teaching program and curriculum that that are designed to really help in our ecological exchange and really step back into understanding the earth as a living, breathing intelligence, what some people call Gaia consciousness. And I want to pause and say that even if folks are stepping into a bonded relationship with spirit and they're not on the track to be like a minister of some kind, they don't necessarily see it as a service piece. They often are stepping into that relationship to evolve or grow or expand their own knowledge and their own practice. And often that will lead to acts of service,
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
even if it's just living the best life that you can possibly live for yourself and your loved ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm also thinking like there was something really interesting you talked about in one of your YouTube videos, which was that when we're like in union with the benevolent, loving spirit, it can be so revitalizing for our nervous system, for our human bodies. And I feel like I've spoken to so many women who have had some kind of really severe nervous system collapse in the last 5 to 6 years, and they told me that there are no more women and maybe even men who've gone through this, like some kind of collective, like yeah, something happening in the nervous system for a lot of women.
Collective burnout.
Yeah, something like that. And I mean, I know it for
Mm-hmm.
myself. I've also been through this,
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
it seems like that could be like also another like major benefit, like for the nervous system healing. And maybe you can speak to that a little bit. How can that kind of union and receiving this divine energy from whatever being we're bonded with like help us heal and like nourish our nervous systems?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nadia. And it does sort of depend on the being that we're bonding to, because
Mm-hmm.
some beings have a little more challenging um, impact on the human nervous system, and it can require, since you brought up Orion, Orion talked about in his story when he began to interface with Bree, um, he had to completely rewire his nervous system. And so in that case, he really had to go through kind of a breakdown, breakthrough, or a transformation process. I experienced something very similar in my bond to Gwen, which is, and for those that don't know, my spirit bond is both to my divine self and also to, or what's sometimes called the holy guardian angel, but also to an other than human being, Gwyn, who is the Welsh god of the Fae. And so that fairy energy is not an easy energy for humans to interface with, to run. It's very it can be very aggressive on the nervous system, similar to sort of the way I experience is it is similar to the Kundalini Shakti energy that releases in the South Asian tantric tradition. And so you really have to prepare your container. So as part of that preparation, to circle back to your question, you go through physical, diet, exercise, sleep, all these kinds of areas that you end up cultivating or sort of overhauling to be able to safely and securely run the system. And the tantric traditions have a lot of great protocols that prepare you for that. And in the fairy faith traditions, we're just sort of beginning to cultivate, because that they're mostly a reclaimed or reconstructed tradition, because we don't have a lot of texts that exist on what our ancestors were doing with the fae back in the back in the olden times, other than a lot of warnings about don't work with them. But in my experience, that caveat of don't work with them is because that it is an intense energy that we have to learn how to manage in our nervous system. So setting aside the more aggressive energy practices, stepping into a relationship with a bonded deity like a Yeshua or an angel, or uh, one of the fairly well established deities that is considered more closer, if you will, to the human nervous system, can be a very revivifying and restorative practice, provided that we understand that when we start cultivating these sorts of practices, we do have to sort of shift and change um, how we treat ourselves, right? Our bodies become temples. They become the place, the interface point for our relationship with these beings. And as such, we can't trash them like, with a lot of the ways that and this is sort of the general treat our bodies by not getting enough sleep, or our diet, our exercise, all those sorts of things kind of come up on the table for how to safely really channel
Yeah.
or host the energies.
Although I must say, I think the Christ energy, like the Christ light, is also very, very intense for the nervous system. And it's like Yeshua was always like telling me, it's like we're going very slow with this. It's like the whole indwelling or embodiment practice, because like he's so concerned with my nervous system, and he is like he knows like how much it can burn through like all the wires, like it was for Orion. And like sometimes I can really also like feel that when I've felt him like moves through me very, very intensely, vividly, like afterwards. Like I told you, it's like I felt like I'm split open by light, and it's almost like I couldn't even walk anymore because my legs were so wobbly and I felt like super disoriented.
Yeah.
So then he's like constantly telling me to ground, 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 and like you have some good practices for that also. So it's just to really, it's like constantly like stretching the human vessel almost.
Yeah.
And
And these traditions that work with, what you're describing as sort of a channeling type practice, or a possessory type practice where you become sort of open and a hollow reed or a hollow bone for that spirit to flow through you. In various traditions that use those tools, use that as a tool, there is preparation, there's support, there's a whole cultural matrix, whether it's the larger culture or even just the spiritual tradition that you're working with, that work with helping you do that in a way that you prepare for it beforehand, you go into the experience, and then you take care of yourself after. And it's sort of integration, and we call it entheogenic, ERIE, entheogenic, reintegration and education, and support. And I'm not getting the acronym correct, but the bottom line is it's set and setting that we construct for ourselves when we're having these encounters that are really so important for the human nervous system to do it in a safe way and in the same way, because that it decenters our ego or our core identity to allow that, if you want to call it a greater or an expanded intelligence, to intermingle with us. And then we have to sort of reintegrate ourselves afterwards and ask ourselves the question, well, who am I that is hosting this energy, and not end up with a massive ego complex as a result, right? We're still just Megan or Nadia brushing our teeth and taking out the garbage.
exactly, yeah, humility definitely, in remembering that we're vessels, and it's for the greater good, right? So, do you want to tell us a little bit about your own like spirit marriage with your beloved Gwen, and how that all came about? I'm sure people are interested.
I mean, that could be. I wrote 2 whole chapters of my book about this, so I'll
Yeah,
give
I
you the
know.
Reader's Digest version, because if you want the nitty gritty of it, I just say go read my book. But
Yes, highly
the
recommended. Great book.
the shorthand is that in the early 2000s, I started having dreams where a being would show up and want to marry me, and they were very erotic dreams, and that eroticism was the way I learned to interpret it was his calling card. It was the way for me to know that it was, and differentiate his presence from the other, ancestors, guides, etc., that I might be interacting with. So when my body sort of lit up like a Christmas tree, um, when I was having contact with Gwyn, was how I would know that it was Gwyn. And the reason I say that is because I needed a real somatic anchor, because a lot of these beings, particularly the Fae, don't necessarily have the same exact guise or visual um, every single time they show up. He would shapeshift a lot,
Yeah.
and so I needed a way to recognize his presence when it was showing up. And so it started out in dreams, and there was a just a distinct moment where he said, "I want you to marry me," and I was like, I don't don't know who you even are. I don't even know your name. And is this even a thing? And I remembered that, in my seminary training, that we had talked about this concept in the Enochian texts of the the sons of God, the angels, and the daughters of men coming together and marrying and forming the Nephilim. And I remembered that and I thought, well, I know that this was a thing that like happened back then, but is it even happening now? And so I literally went, and this was like 2000, 2001. So I went and we didn't even have Google back then. I just put in some search engine, like, spirit marriage, because that was, it was a spirit and it was wanting me to marry it. And Ida Craddock's material came up.
Mm.
The OTO had, I believe it was the OTO, had posted her story, Heavenly Bridegrooms. And I read that and I was like, wow, okay. So she had pulled together a lot of those. She had done a lot of that early research on looking cross culturally, mostly within the Western context. And so I started researching it myself as I was also trying to discern, Gwen's contact and what did he want. So, when a spirit comes and proposes to us, just like as a human were to show up and be like, Nadia, I want you to marry me, and you're like,
Who
who are
are you?
you and why? Uh, I recommend that we take our time and we get to know them and we determine what's the purpose of the marriage. What is, why? Why would I want to do this? Because we have agency, and we do things for in that relationship that others don't necessarily, that they can't necessarily do. So one of my mentors, RJ Stewart, talks about, we do things that they can't, the and the other than human or the spirits do things that we can't. And so when we come together, we create this really, and Orion talks about this too, this really symbiotic relationship. Um, and it expands our perspective as humans, and it gives the spirits an embodied impact in the, the physical world. And so we bring something to the table, and we don't and shouldn't cede that lightly and just sort of give over, our agency, our sovereignty to any spirit that decides that it likes us, and wants to marry us. And so, that also reminds me of, when you were talking about loving benevolent spirits. So there is instances of people having intimate relationships with not so loving and not so benevolent spirits. And that is another caution, that we want to go through this process in a well supported and a well structured way. And whether depending on your inclination and perhaps maybe the spirit that is reaching out to you, there are some systems that you can step into, like the Afro-Caribbean traditions have a lot of decent support around, particularly the Vodou tradition, around how to marry spirits in their pantheon. And they have a whole community support around this. But if you're not in one of those traditions that offers, grounded support, then you have to sort of find the teachers, the mentors, the community that can help ground you in your practice, so that you are developing those sort of what I call the 3Ds of spirit marriage, which are the devotional practice, which is getting to know the other person, like you would be getting the other person being an otherworldly person, right? Like you would get to know somebody that you were dating, for instance. Um, the devotion, the discernment, right? What is this person or this being saying to me? Why are they reaching out to me? What's the, really being able to discern between their voice and the myriad of other, inputs or voices that we get. And then the discipline, which is just showing up and cultivating the relationship, because you're not going to develop a very deep relationship with someone that you don't ever spend time with.
Yeah, exactly. So, like practically, like I know one person who's very devoted to the goddess Kali, and he has been in India and went to her temples and like this kind of worship, and he wants to have a deeper, intimate, bonded relationship with her. So, like, according to your 3Ds, like, how would he go about? Like, how would he, beyond, like, going on pilgrimage, like, in his everyday life, like, how could he start to have a more intimate relationship with you?
Well, in his case, he's lucky because there's so much out there around South Asian devotional practices, right? And with a goddess like Kali, you have a yantra, you have mantra, you have um, cosmograms, right? Yantras are cosmograms or images that are like drawing images, like sacred geometry that represents her. That is, when you have an activated yantra, it's considered to be the actual goddess in that form. You have the morti or the statues that you can find.
Yeah.
There's lots of liturgies or mantra that you can recite. And there is lots of different books and trainings and teachers out there that can teach you how to set up what's called a sadhana or a spiritual practice to a goddess like Kali or a Lakshmi or Shiva. Outside of us, and so that's wonderful, and you have a whole tradition that you can seek out teachers and support systems around. If you are not working with a Kali, say you're like me, where you're working with Gwyn, which is this ancient Welsh deity that hasn't really been worshipped continuously with existing, there's some forms that are out there in my Druid tradition works with Gwyn, but I had to go sort of root around and find them to try and find some of the liturgies for that practice. You have to kind of figure it out on your own. And even in my book, I interview Kama Devi, who is also a deep devotee and married to Kali. And when she first started her bonded relationship with Kali over 20 years ago, there wasn't a lot out there. And so she said she started out with like a few prayers and a small Kali statue. And she, began that devotional practice in a very small, simple way. But it was a daily sitting down and making offerings and listening, and that is often what it will look like with a beloved that we're getting to know is, a daily practice of sitting down and listening for their voice, learning what the sound of their voice. It might not always be an auditory voice. Sometimes it's the feeling of their touch or the visuals that we get. Everybody has different ways or different extrasensory perception of their beloveds, but it's that regular devotional disciplined practice that helps cultivate the discernment.
Right. And what if they feel like they can't hear any voice? What if they say, like, I'm praying every day and I'm really trying to establish contact, but nothing happens? I can't hear them. Like, why could that be? Or what's wrong there?
Well, that's a great point, because that hearing again is just one of the ways that we perceive, right? So ultimately, and this sort of circles back to the we were talking about earlier about our body. Ultimately, what you're attempting to do or what you're cultivating for yourself are sensitization practices where you can become sensitive enough, either through, you know clairaudience, that would be like your hearing, or clairvoyance, that would be seeing, clairsentience, your somatic, or claircognizance, just the knowingness. So beginning to develop, and that falls under the category of discernment, right? What are the things that you can do? I mean, these aren't just connected to spirit marriage or spirit bonds. This is just, intuitive training 101. What are the things that you need to do to heighten your intuition so that you have a greater faculty or greater perception of the other world in general? And there's a whole, list and plenty of clairvoyant and intuition trainings that are out there, that people, or books that you can read to heighten your intuition so that you can begin to have greater perception.
So I just want to say again, everybody who's joining us live, you can type your questions to Megan in the chat, and then if there's anything you want to ask her, we will address that in the end, just so you know. So, like, let's talk gender because Kama, who's married to Kali, one of your co-researchers, right, from your book. So she identifies as a straight woman, right? Like she's
So
not
she's
into any
mostly straight.
mostly straight, right? So and she's married to the goddess Kali now, and they're and from what I read in your book, it sounds like she doesn't really have space for like other human relationships also. So she's like so dedicated in her devotion to Kali that she kind of gave up on men, or like how is that now for her?
Well, for her, in her story, she talks about how she has had relationships with um, humans, but that her relationship with Kali comes first.
Mm.
And so having real mundane human relationships, has been more challenging because the primacy of her relationship with Kali means that there are certain things that she does without question or without fail, and that is, she, I think, gave the example in the book of like every Saturday she devotes every Saturday night to her devotional practice with Kali, and she says that that's made it somewhat challenging to have human relationships because that, the all the things that you do in a mundane human relationship, like, well, let's go visit my family and we're going to go out to dinner this Saturday night, and she's like, well, actually I can't, I have this commitment that I have to do. And so she's found it challenging to be in a relationship with a human person and in her marriage with Kali. That's not the case for everyone, though, that is in a bonded human relationship. The Vodou practitioners that I interviewed, the Haitian practitioners, um, one of the Mambos that I interviewed is married to Ungan, that's a priest and a priestess in that tradition. And in those tradition, in that lineage, you when you're married to a spirit or a loa, is what the deities are called, you spend anywhere from one night a week to one night a month, um, just with your spirit beloved and not with any human partner. And she said that, and you also will often marry more than one spirit.
Polyamorous.
Yeah. So
Okay.
she's married to her human husband. He's married to a constellation of deity. She's married to constellation of deity. And she said if they followed it to the letter, they would never spend any time together as a husband and wife because they would be with all of their spirit companions because of the ways that, and so they negotiated. Right. And I think that's a really important theme is negotiation. And going back to that theme of agency, we have agency. And if we don't feel like we have agency, we really have to step in and question the benevolence and the purpose of the relationship. I personally would caution against anyone that's stepping into one of these relationships that isn't finding that it is bringing greater purpose um, and blessing into their lives. Right? If it's draining you to the point where you can't get out of bed and you can't function and you can't be in relationship with other people, whether you're married to them or not, if you can't have a community around you, then um, I would certainly be cautioning anybody that came to me with that, uh, as like, is this really a bond that is benefiting you?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Is this really a bond that is generative in your life?
Right. So, but let's talk about indwelling because that's where the real magic happens. I think this is very interesting because your human partner is also like a vessel, as I understand it, for your spirit beloved, right? And you shared this amazing story in your book where you met him for the first time at university, right? And then he had these like snakes tattooed on his arm, and you just had this like vision of when they started moving, and you just had this like goosebump moment of like, okay, something's going on here. This is a bit magical. And then what happened?
Yeah, well, I think the idea that we can this sort of moves into the concept of what I said. I have a bond with my divine self, or my HTA. So we have, aside from what we might understand of as an external contact, right, or external beloved, we also have our own divine self that is always active, or always there, present in our life, whether we're aware of it or not. And it's slightly different than the idea of the higher self. At least when I talked to the ceremonial magician Frater Lux about this, the way he described it is, the higher self sort of sits, roughly we have this concept of it sitting in the crown chakra, and the divine self, or the HDA, sits above that. And it's what Jung might have called your archetypal self, or the archetype that you are here to embody on the planet as your blessing, as your way of being here on the planet. And there's myriad different archetypes. And one of the ways that I like to think of the archetypes is through the lens of pantheons of deities. If we look at the Greeks for a moment, there are deities of love like Aphrodite, or deities of the underworld like Hades or Persephone, or deities of the earth like Demeter, and or Artemis, right, of animals. And we might be here to express a quality or a trait of that deity. I might be here to express love. The way that I express love is to teach people how to fall in love with themselves and with these otherworldly beings. And so as that, I'm here doing the work of Aphrodite or Lakshmi or a Mary Magdalene, right? These powerful archetypal love goddesses, which show up then specifically within their own cultural context. So that's what I talk about when I talk about like the divine self. What are the qualities? What are the energies that you're here to express? And so, to circle back to your question about my partner, one of his qualities, one of the things that he is here to express, is this wild force energy of like a horned god, right? Or a Cernunnos. Gwyn is an aspect of that. And so when we have a human partner who is able to theurgically, right? Theurgy is a whole practice of like being in a devotional relationship with a deity, but also in some cases what they call aspecting or embodying, or being possessed by the deity. When you have sort of that dial-up, use an old analogy of a phone, you've got this phone number, right, that is your phone number, that dials you up to the deity. When you're able to express that yourself, and you find someone else that is able to express that, you step into this sort of tantric relationship. So there are, to put our South Asian religion hats on for a moment, in the tantric practice, there are sort of three levels of tantra. There is the I thou relationship between myself and my own Ishta Devi, or holy guardian angel, or divine self, right? And sort of seeing myself as an expression of that. And then there's sort of stepping into the relationship with the externalized deity. So I, Megan, might be in devotion with my spirit beloved Shiva, right? And having it, and then the third layer is the dyadic practice, where I, Megan, and my practice partner, I might be aspecting like Lakshmi, and he might be aspecting Shiva, just to use a gendered, um, you know, uh, male female gender analogy. We're drawing through those divine forces into ourselves, and then interacting in that way. So when, in my book, I talk about the delicious shivers that I got when I met my partner, it was because that I could feel or taste or sense that he had this capacity to aspect or to pull through that energy, and it sort of lit me up, and it took us on this really wild and wonderful journey of exploring that in each other. And so I'm sort of sitting as priestess to him, and he's sitting as priest to me, and we're hosting those energies for ourselves, for our relationship. And that is a very sacred work. And you don't necessarily have to be in a committed relationship with the other person to do that. In fact, in the tantric traditions, you often weren't like married to the person that you were practicing with. It was done within a more ceremonial kind of context. But if you also then choose to step into a human relationship, like my partner and I were, um, we've been in a relationship for 15 years now, then you do have to deal with all the ways that they are not, and you are not the god or the goddess 24/7, right? And so you sort of put your divine channeling or your divine aspecting hat on for a while for a purpose maybe of benefiting the relationship or benefiting a particular working that you're doing, and you take it off and you like chop wood and chop wood and carry water and do the laundry and pay the bills, and you have to navigate both of those
Yeah.
terrains. Looks like I just lost Nadia
No, I'm here.
accidentally. There she is. Okay.
Yeah.
You popped out and then you popped back in. So anyway,
Okay.
that was a very roundabout way of saying that, like, it is a practice of both, recognizing your own divine self resonance and then having a very human relationship that you navigate as well.
Mhm. Yeah, that's Ireland too. Yeah. So in the Christic tradition, like which I'm most drawn to, for obvious reasons, there's like, of course, like we talked about in the beginning, a lot of talk about like the whole bridal imagery, like in the Bible, the wedding garment, the bride of Christ, and Christ being the bridegroom, and all that. And a lot of men I've spoken with find that like hard to navigate because they come from this like gendered perspective of like, yeah, but I'm into women. And even though mystically, like it's more like perceived as, well, it's the soul, and that the soul is feminine, and then Christ is like the masculine presence, like pouring into the soul, which is like a chalice. And we just, like my sacred says, to God we're all women, and we just all receive the beloved's presence. It's still like, I had like one listener on YouTube comment like, okay, but for me this whole imagery of the bride of Christ is too feminine, and I'm married to the Blessed Virgin, and how do I do that? Like, how? Or like another friend like asked me like, I'm I see Jesus more like as my boss, like not as my beloved,
Mm-hmm.
but I want to have a romantic relationship with Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
So
Well,
how do you feel about that?
so yeah, I mean, and I think that's where the growing Magdalene materials,
Hmm.
whether they're rooted in the Gnostic Gospels or whether they're rooted in the more esoteric mystical traditions that are arising around Mary Magdalene and have been for the past, 20, 30 years or so, really gives us, uh, for those that sit within this sort of mystical Christian context, it gives us a great framework to work within that, because that you're right. Traditionally, it was all about, regardless of your gender, you were a bride of Christ, whether you were
Hmm.
male or female or whatever. And not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just that it's leaving out this whole dynamic relationship between Magdalene and Christ, right? Which um contemporary Christian, I mean, and really Christianity from around the Council of Nicaea and onward sought to kind of eradicate, right? Her co-equal relationship with Christ as his first disciple and as his beloved. If you approach it from the perspective of, that she was a co-teacher and a um, beloved alongside him, or his Jesus wife, right? As
For
some
sure. Yeah, yeah.
researchers
Companion. Yeah.
and companion, as some researchers postulate. So if we bring that back into Christianity, then we have this great model for a co-creative love relationship between, in the case of your friend, then he arises as Christ and his beloved is the Magdalene. right? And he's doing the work, which we all have been encouraged to do through the Christian lens of being Christ-like. So he's doing the work of being Christ-like, or bringing that Christian, that Christed presence into himself, right? And there's some that would argue that the Christ energy is a not a gendered energy, right? That there's Yeshua,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
man, and Magdalene, the woman, right? And that together they were hosting the Christed energy, and using the concept of Christ as sort of an awakened or an enlightened one. And so we can all be Christed beings, and that's not a gendered concept, right? That's just being a Christed being is what I would say folks who are in the process of entheosis, or awakening the divine within, right? Stepping into dynamic relationship with the divine self, which we just got done talking about, is a process of being Christed. It's a process of awakening this rarefied aspect of ourselves, and stepping into greater and greater resonance with it, so that it becomes how we see and speak and touch and interact in the world, to be a blessing.
Exactly. That's it. Exactly.
Yeah, I'll pause there.
Mm. Yeah, beautiful. And there are so many ways we could go over this now. I mean, it's so much. But I want to come back to this listener question, because this one man who asked me about this, like he's celibate and he's married to the Blessed Virgin. So there comes this like the erotic aspect. Like, can this be like completely celibate and still be married to a deity, or is it always naturally erotic, or like how is it different? Because like you said something really beautiful in one of your videos on YouTube, where you said that energy, like the divine energy, like when we experience it in our human vessels, it can feel so vitalizing that we may perceive it as deeply erotic and sexual or sensual, but it may not necessarily be the intention of like Christ or any angel or being, that they're not even coming with a sexual vibe towards us, but we may perceive it like that. And this is actually what I heard from many people now, also have seen, especially in women, when they really receive spirit in their bodies or from within, even like it feels very activating, and like many have said to me, but this feels very sexual. And that's their experience, and of course it can feel erotic, but like you also said, it's really important to point out that for some people this might be frightening, or they might get triggered, or they feel like, oh, it's not within my consent. And then to remember that maybe it's like, for me, I experienced it as Kundalini, and Kundalini is just like life force energy, right? It's activating. We may experience it as very, very blissful and ecstatic, but from the end of spirit, it may not always be intended as being erotic or sexual in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I think, we really kind of have to tease apart some of the terminology, right? We, particularly here in the West, we have a very, like, if anything gets me aroused, then that means it's sexual. And arousal energy is just our life force, right? And we can be aroused in a variety of different ways, right? We tend to only associate arousal in our pelvis, but you can be aroused in your heart, you can be aroused in your brow, and all that's really happening energetically is that you're having a quickening or a vitalization of those areas in the body. So that is and we term that eros, right? But eros or erotic just simply means enlivenment, awakening, activation. You use the word activation, right? Sexuality then is, I mean, it's so multivalent and multi-layered, and I teach a whole course on religion and sexuality in at Cherry Hill, so I won't go too far down the rabbit hole on that. But what I will say is that how you choose to express that eroticism, that enlivenment, is then sort of your sexual identity. Do you choose to be celibate and just use that energy for yourself? So celibates aren't asexual or non-erotic. I mean, look at the Beguines. The Beguines were very erotic, but they were channeling it entirely in this vitalizing way with the lady love or with the beloved, with Christ. And it wasn't about having sex necessarily with Jesus. It was about having this activation of the body, right, that is full of that vitalism, that life force or eros energy that you then move. And sex magicians understand this. You move it into intention or into offering or into practice or into, spell work or whatever. And so then, we really need to learn how to decouple this idea of sexuality, and what we're doing with ourselves or others, from this idea of vitalism or eroticism, because that you can be asexual and still be, have that, people that are asexual, they still have vitality, right? They still have vitalism. They might not want to express that with another human, but they still have, we all have orgone energy. We all have the chi, the prana, the jing chi, right? That is our vitalizing energy that runs through our bodies. And sexuality, I would offer, is how we decide to express that, whether we express it externally with someone else, whether we keep it internally and have a solo practice, or whether we just use that in more of an esoteric mystical way in our relationship. So you can absolutely be in a bonded relationship with a spirit and not have sexuality even be a part of it. But you might still have a vitalizing experience when you're connected to your bonded spirit beloved.
Hmm. So that brings us perfectly to Ida Craddock, and you just mentioned like sex magic and like tell us about Ida. I know you have a soft spot in your heart for her, and I've read a
Yeah.
little bit about. Let's
Ida
talk
was
about
this
Ida.
Ida was this really brilliant early 20th century mystic who was a champion of women's erotic experience. And she was a single woman who was married to an angel, and she wrote pamphlets that and books, materials that advocated for, gasp, women's pleasure during sex. Radical idea. Or that women should have agency and should be able to decide when and if they wanted to have sex, with, in this, in that frame, their husbands. Did they want to have sex with their husbands? They should be able to say yes or no. And so she wrote these pamphlets that she would mail out, and she had like a mail order, um, going for different instruction on how to, essentially how to cultivate pleasure in your own body. And she claimed that she knew all of this through the guidance of her spirit husband, who was an angel, or who she claimed to be an angel. Now, there's some question as to whether he was an angel or whether he was the deceased spirit of a man that she knew in her life. Both of her journals point to, and it doesn't have to actually be an either or, because that, in her, the way she understood Soph was that he had been this man and then became an angel when he died.
Okay.
So she said that, he came to her and wanted to instruct her in these sort of sex magic type practices. And so she received all of her training from him, and began to teach others about it, and unfortunately was persecuted horribly as a result. And her story does not end well. It's a very tragic story, but she was not traditionally educated. Back then, there were very few opportunities for her to get a formal education. And so she was very self-educated and had done all of this research tracing the, traditions of the Nephilim and the Enochian sons of gods and daughters of man. And she did in Heavenly Bridegrooms, she does this really interesting tracing of mystical, erotic Christianity. And she was picked up later by the sex magicians within the OTO and other ceremonial orders, and sainted, basically, as one of the forerunners of erotic mysticism and erotic sex magic. because that's essentially what she was saying is, we have these partners that these otherworldly partners that we can do this work, and we can focus that energy, that erotic energy, that vitalism of the body into different uh, either thought forms or co-creative projects or whatever we're wanting to send that energy into. And when I say energy, there's so many different terms that we could use for that, but that's sort of a catchphrase for prana, chi, orgone, vitalism, this idea of the erotic energy of the body.
Mm. So does Ida in her book go more into detail how the ancients instructed her, or it was like through some kind of meditation?
Yeah,
Or
she talks about some of the techniques that he taught her, breath work techniques, movement techniques, and one of the things that she was a really strong advocate of was the danse du ventre, which is the belly dance that was premiered here in the West at the World's Fair that was happening. I think it was the Chicago World's Fair, and she attended that, saw the women doing these belly dances, and was like, "Oh, that's a way to cultivate this energy." And so she practiced, and I don't know if she ever taught belly dance, but she was a big advocate of belly dance.
okay. Because people were like wondering, like, how did you learn all of this? Like, you're an unmarried woman. Like, how do you have all this knowledge? Like, how can you teach women about sex if you don't even have a husband? Right?
Yeah, and that was her claim, that she had this, or had a spirit husband that taught her all of this.
Mm. And then what happened?
And then Anthony Comstock, who was the postal inspector, chief postal inspector of the time, had a vendetta against her and threw her in an insane asylum
An insane asylum.
because that she claimed to be married to a spirit. And so, she was sending out these pamphlets. So I should back up and say she was sending out these pamphlets in the mail. He deemed them as pornographic.
That's why the mailman. Okay.
Yeah, that's why so he had put in place something called the Comstock Law, which was essentially making it criminal to mail anything anything that had anything lewd or sexual or suggestive in it, to use the mail to mail that. And so he deemed what she was writing as lewd and pornographic, and she was arrested a few times for doing it. And then and I'm not remembering the exact historical dates and timeline, but I know that at some point she was institutionalized, because that, when they interviewed her about this, she told people, that she was married to this angel, and they're like, "You're married to an angel? Well, you must be crazy." So they put her in an institution, and when she came out, she didn't stop. She continued to mail things and to speak out publicly. And when he was persecuting her again, trying to get her shut away, she ended up committing suicide. So she didn't have to go back into the insane asylum. Yeah. So so her story is not. Her story is in some ways sobering, right? Because that, what she was writing was, we think of now as just, like women's liberation and sexual liberation, and she was very, very ahead of her time. And she wasn't writing anything salacious or pornographic. It was all about, how to use the body in a way that vitalizes it. But in any event, when I did my research, and when my research became, because the book Spirit Marriage was originally my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, and I turned it into a book. And both the dissertation and the book are dedicated to Ida as a kind of um, redemptive or reclamation, elevation of her spirit.
Mm.
Um, and her story, because that she's been kind of the patron saint of this work.
Mm. Great. Thank you for doing that.
Hmm.
Beautiful. Okay, so is there like one takeaway that, as we're running off now, that you would like our listeners to really if they remember one thing from this conversation, like what will it be?
Yeah. The takeaway is this: we might not all have a spirit that is ringing our doorbell wanting to marry us. And we might not all know a spirit that we want to cultivate a bonded devotional relationship with, an externalized spirit. But each of us has a divine self. Each of us has uh, uh, the divine within that is attempting to arise out of us. And sometimes just knowing that that part of us is actionable is enough to step onto the path of discovery, to step onto the path of inquiry. Like, who who am I, if I am in this rarefied divine aspect of myself, what is that? And how do I get to know it? And how do I create more space in my psyche, more space in my nervous system to arise as that aspect of myself? Because we're always arising as different aspects of ourself, whether it's a wounded part of ourself or a child part of ourself or a mystical part of ourself. And so what does it mean to center or to put primacy on the divine part of ourself, right? This wise, expanded, rarefied part, and begin to see through their eyes.
Love it. Megan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been such a joy to have you and to chat with you. I adore you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Nadia. I always love coming and talking to folks about this material. And if anyone is interested in, support and further cultivation around this, you can find me at drmeganrose.com. And I have a 3 Keys to Spirit Marriage download that you can access there, as well as a whole little mini lecture on Entheosis. I've mentioned it a few times, this divine self process. So you can sign up for my newsletter and receive a free mini course on Entheosis, the art
Yes,
of awakening the divine within.
exactly. And you also have lots of great videos on your website where you interview your co-researchers and have like these amazing conversations with
Yeah.
people. We get to know them. Some of
Yeah,
them
I
at
have a
least.
whole YouTube channel with lots of content on it as well, which you can access through my website.
And everybody, like, I really recommend Megan's book. It's absolutely thought-provoking, healing, mind-opening. Absolutely loved it. So again, thank you for doing the work you do, and yeah, thank you for being here. And
Thank
all the
you.
best to you in your journey. And thank
Blessings.
you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
Blessings. Thank you for watching, guys. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.